Now, I was skeptical when the television adaptation of the Deadlands was announced, but interested to see what they'd do. I'm gonna be honest, I was not a huge fan of the film. It had its moments, but for me it was overly cheesy, with some very dodgy writing, particularly when it came to dialogue. The story was also not very memorable, and just seemed quite empty. With this in mind, you can understand my worry when writer Glenn Standring was brought over to carry his creation to the silver screen. I was hopeful though, as this concept has a lot of potential, as do stories of this nature as a whole. It seems my country is trying to take steps in making more dramatic and high production value shows to make a name for ourselves in this random corner of the world. So, has the Deadlands achieved its goals of progressing our storytelling? I hate to be a downer right off the bat, but the beginning of this show really rubbed me the wrong way. In more ways than one, actually. One thing stood out to me immediately on watching the opening credits. This introduction is really, what's the word I'm looking for? In your face. It was definitely intentional, and the show does continue this trend throughout to much better results, but it feels undeserved for the show to jump straight into overblown intro credits like this. Now, being someone who was very into the extravagant and pretentious intro, I was excited at the notion of one for this. But, the cuts to black to show the credits are almost the sole reason for this. While the edits themselves are fast paced, it's too jarring, and instills said credits with more importance than the shots we're seeing in between, which for me is disappointing, because for one thing, the shots are beautiful. I understand that they're going for a more cinematic film-like feeling, but I think it's unnecessary, as the show does it fine without this. Now with that, I do think the first episode is the weakest of the 8, and I'll be honest, I was not impressed with what followed the intro. While I'm talking about the beginning of the episode, I will say that this intro time in every other episode is used as a previously on, which lends itself to this format far better. These segments though are far too long, and considering there are only 8 episodes, there is not much to actually catch up on. Narration can be used to great effect, but most instances of its use are terrible. Immediately we are given information we could have just experienced with the character. It's a shame because this is one of the only times the show uses narration other than the recaps at the beginning of each episode, and typically I think a strong point of this show is that it does get information across rather well. The entire first episode suffers from what initially seemed to me as trying to fit too much into its pilot, which I can understand, as Māori culture is something that will need some context for a large portion of its audience. But the rest of the show does a great job at sprinkling in background details and information, so there was something else here. This first episode's major flaw is the way it sets up the story. As well as the narration being the thing that kicks a major part of the plot in motion, we don't spend enough time with our two heroes before they embark on their adventure, which is crucial for both of their characters' journeys. The female lead, Mehe, has her tribe as a key part of said journey, and the people in it make regular appearances, but we don't spend enough time with them to care about anything that actually happens to them, and in turn makes Mehe's motivation quite stale. The attack on her village and the messages she receives from the dead happens off-screen, which doesn't make any sense, especially considering it involves a major plot beat going forward. The male lead, Waka, also suffers from some proper character context. He's supposed to be a feared warrior that is beyond redemption, yet when we meet him, not including the narration that introduces him, he is given his offer to redeem himself right off the bat, which he gladly accepts. We see him fight once, and then he gets killed, all in a montage. Granted, he initially does it for selfish reasons, but the show needed more time to establish him making that decision. The first episode would have been much more effective had we experienced Waka's savagery and Mehe's family struggles firsthand. We should have spent the early moments of the episode relishing in their characters at the beginning of the story to understand who they are, before both their lives change forever when they're confronted with death. From there, we can end with the two meeting and deciding to work together. Thankfully, the show takes this advice going forward. This show is gorgeous. The stunning cinematography really lets the land of Aotearoa speak for itself. The colours are vibrant and the various colour schemes complement and contrast each other really well. The big sweeping shots do so much to add mystique and wonder to the setting of the show. I was also impressed with the production value. There is a lot of attention to detail when it comes to costumes here, so I need to give credit to that team and their efforts. Waka's markings are especially noteworthy. The actual Deadlands in particular are stylized, being in complete black and white, except for the characters. I would normally put this off as a bit too on the nose, but the show's saturated colours and the fact it does not take itself too seriously makes this a welcome decision. The main theme for the show is great, and while I have gripes with the opening for the show, every episode is definitely elevated by the theme's inclusion, both at the start and the end. With that, they do reuse the main theme far too often. The show suffers from a similar drag that I notice a lot of Netflix shows suffer from, and that is reusing the one good track over and over again. They're not even alterations of any leitmotifs present, it's just the exact same track. And it's a shame, because the tracks are damn good. Going into this show, I was curious as to how they were going to tackle the dialogue, as the film was completely in Te Reo Māori. The show decides to have it in English this time, which was curious. I'm guessing this reason was to make it more accessible? The main issue with this decision is that the show stops abruptly far too often to translate the Māori words that they do use. It would have been far more coherent if they had picked a language and stuck to it. These complaints lie with the words thrown into conversations in English, which are always followed by the English translations immediately after, which completely take you out of the show and is incredibly unnatural, just halting the pace completely. With that said, I did love how the show used Te Reo Māori when reciting karakia, or when the witch characters would perform a task. Those moments flow naturally and instill the language with this mysticism not often seen. This is amplified by lack of context and subtitles, and is what I would hope a show like this would do. Regardless of the language, the dialogue in this show is very hit and miss. Most of the time it's harmless, but then a scene will hit you with the dullest line you've ever heard. Now for the most part, the performances in this show are decent, so it's not particularly them, although we do get some interesting line deliveries from time to time. The humour is an interesting case. A lot of the time it comes across as dry and unfunny, but the show did get chuckles out of me often. I think a lot of this comes down to Te Kohe Tūhaka's performance as Waka Nukuro, more so than the lines themselves, and the fact the show often does not take itself super seriously. Alright, I've talked about everything except the actual story, so I should probably get into that. Waka Nukuro is a great character, and his development throughout the series is spot on, although I think they waffle about with the ending too much. Once we get past the exposition in the beginning, his dry wit and straight to the point character really drives the story and the humour that is present. It's curious that they recast him from the film, where he played the villain, but by the end I think Te Kohe Tūhaka proves himself in this role. I have less to say about Darlene Christian as Mehe. Her performance was fine, I guess.
Not great, not terrible.
And served the story's purpose well, but I would like to see what she could do with some better writing. There are a few problems with Mehe's story. The aforementioned lack of building and screen time for a supporting cast lets down a lot of the core drama with her character. There is also a sudden spike of mystery revolving around her character midway through, which either should have been brought in at the beginning or left out entirely. If they wanted the reveal that Mehe could speak to the dead, why does every episode start with
"The dead, they sighed to me, and I heed them,"
which is also really random and kind of a silly delivered line anyway. Speaking of mystery, I wish the show stuck to telling the story strictly from their perspectives. While I like cold opens, not that you could properly call these cold opens, they spoil far too much of what the episode is about. While the show isn't strictly episodic, most of the episode's content is pretty self-contained. The show is great when it lets the mystery tell itself, but these cold opens ruin any intrigue that might have been present otherwise. Characters like Meher's uncle had potential, but are ultimately let down by the writing. And in this specific case, his end is the dullest, most predictable thing in the whole show. Now, the elephant in the room is that this show is about zombies. While it may be obvious given the title or if you watch the trailer, the film had nothing to do with this. I'm fine with the show taking a departure, but I find it odd that this show labels itself as essentially a linked story somewhat, yet remains completely detached. The undead stuff itself is nothing you haven't seen before, albeit these are far more sentient undead, and there are allusions to things that may happen later down the line that I think will do much to freshen up this part of the story. What this show does excellently though is the conflict between the living characters. Typically, this is just a natural extension of zombie stories, with the human drama being far more interesting, and I think ultimately this is the same. I will say though, that when the show focuses on the culture and the intertribal relationships, it is far more enthralling than Waka beating some dead people on the back of the head with some bone. This is why I'm ultimately let down by the first episode so much, as I think if it was handled better, these moments would be even more powerful, rather than having to remind myself who these characters are and why I should care about them. At its core, when these conflicts are done right, the show is splendid to watch, and I think if they continue to focus on these elements, and the pretty good ratio they have already of living to undead conflict, we will be in for a treat in the future. The Deadlands has some big writing flaws, and while it seems like the entire video was downing on it, there is some good stuff here. When the show hits its beats well, it's a very enjoyable show, full of fun action, great visuals and music, and a pretty basic story told in a different and interesting way. Its exploration of Māori culture is natural and flows with the story excellently, minus a few shitty exposition dumps. While I would have liked to see the entire show subtitled, I think what they have works. They just need to work on the dialogue a bit more. The future of the show is unknown, and I do hope they come back to the Deadlands, because this show could be something really special. I revel in the critiques, but that's because the good stuff in the show is great, and I hope they can take notes here to elevate the show to a consistently good level. Is it what Aotearoa needs? I won't be so dramatic, but it is worth the watch. As I've experimented with different video ideas, I think I've decided to stop the reviews for now, at least in a more traditional sense. Making this video made me realise that it is a much more fun way to analyse and review content, so for the future, these will replace them. Stay safe guys, and stay serious.